We have a podcast here with Tim and Adam. We're talking about different biblical topics. Just a little bit of background. Tim and I have been in Christians for a long time. We've been part of the church. We've been in paid ministry positions, both of us. Tim has been a pastor. He's led a church. I've seminary graduate. We're not experts by any stretch of the imagination, but we have opinions and we know a thing or two. And so today I was thinking that we would talk about modern church culture, church practices, and kind of how it is maybe a little bit different than the early church and maybe how Jesus would have envisioned us doing church. And Tim, I'll tell you something that I thought that, or I had kind of a weird, moment. So I just kind of have like this weird knowledge about, like Christmas trees, for example, is like very pagan. It's honoring the god Odin, and it's like people who practice pagan rituals of like bringing Christmas trees inside, and that kind of got adopted into Christian culture. And then like the cross, many of us know that was like Jesus was killed on the cross. It was like a torture device used by the Romans. And so I had a moment the other day in church. It was in the time of recording this, it's February, but it was Christmas time, and we had our church stage was decorated with a giant cross with like Christmas trees around it. Mm-hmm. And I kind of sat back and looked at it, and I thought, like, this is a weird thing. If you think about it in context, it's like a torture device surrounded by pagan honoring trees. And it's in a Christian church, and we don't really think about it like that. But it's different than maybe it would be probably shocking for Jesus to see that. Well, I would imagine.
If he is omnipotent, I feel like it might be a little bit less shocking.
Okay.
He might already be aware, but
now for sure, but.
Yes, it's I was listening to this podcast. A friend of mine sent me the other day, and it was he seemed like really hesitant to share it with me. Like he's like, hey, you really have to take it with like a grain of salt. The guy's super weird. He's like, he's like on the spectrum, but then he gets into just all this weird stuff. So it's like, you just have to be aware, like don't take it too seriously. And I feel like it was one of the more fascinating podcasts. Like there's nothing, it's like all the things that I'm into. So I realized maybe I'm the weirdo. I think it's normal. Okay. But he's interviewing this guy who's, he's the podcast is from a guy in Ireland. And, has this guy in there who's doing this research into the similarities between Irish and Indian culture. So they like their folklore and their gods and goddesses are like very similar.
Indian like Native Americans or like India
like
Indians?
Subcontinent India.
Okay.
And like you go back, everybody came out of Africa. It's the idea, and then thousands of years ago, there's the Aryan culture, that are it's kind of like Europeans are descended and Indians from this people who are kind of in the Caucasus region. So the Caucasian, what we call that, comes out of this area. So the Irish and Indian both kind of come from the same area, as most people who have European ancestry would, but Ireland is kind of cut off from everything else. There's during the last ice age, there's a land bridge that connects Europe and Ireland, and then that goes away. And then you have thousands of years, and like their culture kind of remains. So there's like all these different like it's the same story basically, and the word sounds the same. So even like the Brahmins in India and the Druids, they're like, if you look at the Irish name and the Indian name, like it's basically the same, and they kind of have that same role. And it's just like fascinating that we're, you know, there's not that much new. We kind of just reinvent and retell things and take what's there and we kind of fit it into something else. And I feel like that is what Christianity has done. I'm not saying that like that means that God's not real, but I feel like the church, like the cross, isn't anything to do with God. It's something that like we use to point towards that, or like the holidays are basically all the old pagan festivals repurposed. I feel
Yeah,
like it's such a.
and I
Go
will
ahead.
say I don't feel like this is necessarily a negative thing.
Mm-hmm.
I know some people like to point to the early church and be like, "That's how we should do church," and how church has evolved is bad.
Mm-hmm.
I do not feel that. I don't fit in that camp. I don't feel like just because what we're doing is different or may than how they used to do it, it means I mean things evolve,
Mm-hmm.
but it is markedly different.
Mm-hmm. So, how do you think things should kind of take place and take shape?
Uh I mean, I don't know. I guess I don't know how like it should necessarily, but I mean, I do like a lot of elements of the early church. So and it is weird too because like there's the early church, the early Christian church, like Jesus' followers, and then there's like the early like Jewish church that they came out of, and even that was different, and they were trying to figure out amongst themselves like, all right, how do we do church? But one element of it that I think is kind of lost is the fact that they really were a commune. I mean, they were communists basically. Like they lived together, they shared everything they had, um, and
Easy, easy.
well, I'm just saying. I mean, and they ate meals together. Like they basically like you know, and it's like
So
for.
you're looking to be socialist and to have someone cook for you, and that's
I'm not.
basically.
I'm not advocating we go back to this necessarily, but there's an
Just.
element of it that it's like they were super intense about their daily. It wasn't like, all right, we're gonna go to church on Sunday and then we're gonna live the rest of our lives during the week. Like for
Mm-hmm.
them, it was very much like they did go to synagogue on Sunday or on whatever day they went, probably Saturday at the time. But they also like every day prayed together. Every day we're living together. There's like this
Mm-hmm.
togetherness that I think is we're lacking a lot in today's culture.
Hmm. And do you feel like so like the do you feel like that's kind of an outgrowth of like Western Christianity, like capitalism, or is that more of just 2,000 years?
I think it's probably both. And again, when I talk about church, I mean you make a good point. I'm talking about like the church that I recognize, like American, kind of westernized church. And there is an element of like our culture has gone that way, and our church is kind of a reflection. It morphs too with the different cultures, and
Mm-hmm.
I don't think that's
Yeah.
a bad. I don't think that's a negative thing.
Well, but I think it sounds like what you're saying is like there's a positive aspect to the communal elements that we've lost in
Yeah,
maybe more capitalist Christianity.
sure.
Like,
I mean, it seems to me that that was a very important thing for the early church.
mm-hmm. And what do you feel like has replaced that?
I don't know, man. I feel like that gets into a lot of where we're at. I mean, as a society, we've grown a lot more isolated and a lot more
Mm-hmm.
lonely.
And I think in the last couple of years, or maybe 10, 15 years, but like since COVID, I feel like, people, you form a habit and then you stick to it. And COVID changed everybody's habits. And I
Sure,
think it accelerated things that would have happened either way, but
I
like
agree.
we work from home, whereas that was not possible for most people, you know, before COVID. just like drone warfare was not really around until the Ukraine thing, and so it's like we have these things. They didn't start it. Like the that these things would have happened eventually, maybe, but
Sure.
it jumps it, and then you form all your new habits because there is like that event, and like we are isolated. I think a lot of that is also like social media. Like it scratches that itch, but doesn't give you anything. It makes you feel like you've met the need, but it's not any of the actual stuff.
Sure.
So it's like I feel like we don't feel the need for community because it's like you're interacting with people, or you feel like you're interacting, but you're not really. You're not like sharing anything with them.
Yeah.
There's like all these people doing podcasts, and it's just like I think maybe the worst thing for humanity.
Well, we're contributing a little bit then, I would say.
Why do you say that?
Well, are we not doing a podcast right now?
I thought we were just talking.
Well, let me ask you this, Tim.
Mm-hmm.
So Jesus, what do you feel like his, um, what do you feel like he would have wanted our church to look like? Because he doesn't really set up. He doesn't when he comes to Earth. He doesn't really set up a
Mm-hmm.
system of religion.
So I've like seen some people. I remember watching like an interview with somebody, and it was maybe more of an interaction between these two people. One was like I think so, not like a missionary, but I think they lived permanently in. I know that they live in Africa, but maybe they were traveling. I can't remember exactly, but they were essentially like saying, "Hey, Jesus has called you to heal the sick," and then people were standing up and healing the sick. And there's this pastor there who's like, "Hey, stop it! These people aren't trained. You can't just like set them free to do this. They have to be trained. They like have to have some sort of background." And like this missionary woman was like, "No, it's just they can do it. It's fine. They don't need anything. Jesus didn't say you had to have anything. They're free to go." And like it was this argument back and forth, like different reasons. I feel like intellectually I agree with that guy. Like there's so much power you have, and you should have some understanding of that. But Jesus didn't seem to actually do any of those things in practice. Like he kind of just set people free to do whatever, make mistakes, and then ask questions afterwards. Which is like how kids learn. It's how we learn as human beings. So maybe that makes sense.
Well,
But it's also
yes and no.
messy.
Like his disciples spent a long time, a lot of time. Like he
Mm-hmm.
mentored them. He did teach them.
But he
He
sent
didn't
them
teach.
out. He sent them out. Like he did stuff with them, and then he sent them out
Yeah, he
and was
let them
like, "Hey,
fail and figure stuff out on their own.
try it out." And then there's like people in the New Testament who are like going and healing, or maybe it was before. I can't remember. It was like maybe in Acts, and somebody asked like the disciples like, "What this person's healing people, is that from God or the devil?" And
Yeah,
like there's essentially saying, "Hey, if they're helping people, why are you having such a problem with this?" But like they're
yeah.
not trained, they're not informed.
If they're not against us, they're for us, or something like
Yeah.
that. Yeah. Um. Okay. So that's like a well, that's like a training. I mean, I get that. So like Jesus wasn't super as far as setting up like religious practices. So when we think about church today in modern times, we think about like the practices, like when do we go, what does it look like, what is the format, what are the structures that we follow, and a lot of the structures are based in biblical stuff. Like you have elders, you have a leadership structure, and people generally churches try and like stick to that. But that was stuff that like Paul set up. You know, it was stuff
And
that,
Paul he liked systems.
and he did, and
Jesus
he
did not seem to like systems.
Jesus did away with a lot of stuff, like the Sabbath, or he
Mm-hmm.
didn't do away with it, but he like, you know, like he
Certainly
didn't.
wasn't preserving it.
Yeah, and then like the things that Jesus kind of like either concluded or did away with or separated from were like the Sabbath, the temple, the law, and sacrifices, and these are things that like we
Mm-hmm.
don't generally observe today, like,
Mm-hmm.
and because Jesus is the fulfillment of those things. So it's kind of like he did away with a lot more things than he brought as far as systems and religion and things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I feel like it is. I think Jesus and Paul are very different people, but we kind of model everything after Paul because it's a lot easier.
Well, he
Like,
gave us a lot more like
yeah,
things that
I mean,
Jesus almost gave us none of.
yes, well, and so I think like that's on purpose. I kind of wonder if that's on purpose, in that like you have to kind of go to God, and like there isn't room for you to like start controlling people, like building a governmental system around it, which seems like Jesus is like was opposed to, whereas like Paul is not necessarily opposed to it. Um, and it's easy as something's growing. Like it's a lot easier to grow if you have a system. Like it's easier for everybody. But it seemed like Jesus was also kind of trying not to grow things. So it is like a very interesting thing where he was actively doing things that sent people away, whereas Paul was actively trying to get people to come in. So like it is different. And if you don't care about growth, maybe you don't have to have the systems.
Yeah, it's an interesting dichotomy there.
Would you be okay if all the systems and all the rules just went away?
I mean, it'd be hard. It's human nature to want, like you were talking about earlier with the routine. Like we established routines, and I feel like if everything that we knew went away, we would just establish different routines. You know what I'm saying, to fill in the
Mm-hmm.
holes.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not saying like there's anything wrong with modern church. I'm not saying that we necessarily need to do anything differently. And then there's like the verses like in Hebrews it says, "Do not neglect meeting together," as some people do. Um, so it is important, but it doesn't necessarily
But what they were
say,
talking about was like not a church service. That was like hanging out in somebody's house.
yeah, which I mean, which they prayed, they did in the name of the Lord. They weren't just chilling like movie night. I mean, they were, what I'm saying, they were
No,
meeting
but
together was prayer and breaking bread and doing communion.
like,
Um,
and those are all like words we use now. Like they are religious words we use for something they did. That was just like they ate their stuff together, like they hung out. And I think that like we do think that they, like they would have community meals. Like it's kind of what they did, and like we've evolved that into a church service that's like very. I mean, there's like maybe a little bit of community to it, like stand up and say hi to somebody near you. But a lot of churches don't do that. And then like even the ones that do, it's very superficial. So it's kind of like we are not doing the thing he said to do, but we're just doing another like rule in a system that doesn't really scratch the itch again. Or it scratches the itch, but it doesn't actually do the thing. It's like build community.
so
Not
do
to say
you,
that church doesn't do that, but
sure. So let me ask you this: do you feel like as a Christian, that we need to go to church? Are we
no.
commanded to do that? Is that something necessary for us to be Christians?
No. I don't. I think it's
Okay.
good. Um and helpful. But I I think that like there, if you look through the New Testament, like Paul says a lot of things, but if you look at like the actual story of his life, like they basically like there's the Jews, there's the Gentiles, and like they came up with a system of rules for the Gentiles, and it was like don't sleep around, don't drink blood, give to the poor. Like that was it. There's three rules that like the early church set out for the because Judaism was just like a huge set of rules, and the idea was like that didn't help. We needed Jesus, and like the rules didn't help. So what are some things that like people who don't grow up with Judaism can do? And that was it. Like pretty basic. So I feel like the idea of we're commanded to do this and this is why we should do it. Like it's so antithetical to what Christianity really seemed to be about in the first century. Like we need those rules now, or we feel like we do because it's chaos without it. But it's also kind of sterile. Like there's a lack of something there, I think. Do you like rules? You like
I
controlling
mean,
people?
I like systems. You know, I think it's normal, but I like knowing. You know, just like everybody else, I like knowing where the boundaries are and what you know. And then
And
maybe
why
I'll
is
like.
that?
I think there's maybe like comfort in it.
Well, like tell tell me about that. Like why is that someone boundaries? Like you can't go past this line. Why is that comforting?
I'm not sure. I mean, I feel like I personally I enjoy the community that comes with the church. Like I'm involved. I know people there, and I think there's value in coming together. And I agree with you that I don't think you need to go to church. I don't think that's like a commandment. I think you can be a Christian and not attend regularly. Um, but it is a healthy thing if you do want to grow and you do want to have accountability. And I think about that verse in Hebrews that says like, "Let us not neglect meeting together." And I feel
But
like, oh, go ahead.
are you? Do you work at a church right now?
Yes.
So hang on.
Oh, no. How are we gonna do this, huh?
There's a little conflict of interest here. I feel like so maybe we. I've only pretty much only ever heard of the requirement to go to church from church
I'm not saying
leaders.
there is a
Where
requirement. I'm
I'm just
saying there's.
saying, when you mix money,
Eh.
somebody's I don't know here.
All right. Well,
But
that brings another question. So what I was about to say was like there's a Hebrews verse that every church leader, not like me, who's just just a peon, but I mean like an actual like head pastor, will say, all right. Hebrews 10:25 says, "Let us not neglect meeting together." So that means that we're commanded to go to church. And I agree with you that that's not really what that verse is implying. I mean, the meeting together in that case was like meals and living together in that kind of commune setting. But it gets used a lot. It gets bantered about today as trying to get people to church, and it's interesting how things kind of evolve like that.
so why do you think, um, or maybe devil's advocate? So if you didn't have, if that wasn't a requirement, what would be required? Like what's he talking about when he says like don't neglect meeting together, which is basically, I mean I haven't looked at like the Greek, but seems like hanging out is what he's saying, like meeting in the same place.
Which
Um,
is church, which wouldn't happen if we didn't go to church. So maybe it is
well,
that.
but they didn't have church then, so
Right. But we only
if
have the church now as far as that.
well, we don't though because we
I'm
have what they had, which is different people who exist in the same geographic area. So like if church did not exist, like what would that look like? Like how could you fulfill that? What are you saying? And maybe more what that original statement is really like getting at. Like what's the purpose of that? And what's if you weren't going to church,
Well, the
you
purpose
weren't
would
pulling on.
be, it says it in the verse, is to encourage one another, especially
So do,
now
but
in
you
the day
feel
of
like
his return.
do you feel like people in church encourage each other, or is it more like one person does the encouraging and everybody else listens?
Well, I mean, I guess that depends on the person, the attender. I mean, it's kind of designed to be one person doing a lot of the encouraging, but that doesn't need to be the case.
So maybe the system is the thing that's wrong. If it's the opposite of what he's like, the original intent was to have people like use the gifts that they all have to encourage each other, and now we have a system where one person encourages everybody or doesn't
Well,
encourage.
well, they did. They had that same system as well back then. I mean, the Jewish synagogue, you'd have a teacher could get up and
They had
kind of
a
give a
good
perspective
sound
on.
system and
Well, basically, it would have been like that. But that wasn't the end all be all. Then at that point, that was
but
like
that's not when
a
he was.
facet.
I could be wrong, but I think he's not talking to a Jewish audience in
In
that verse, is
Hebrews.
he? In Hebrews. Now, the way you say that, they would probably be Jewish. Um, the Hebrews probably would have been Jewish, wouldn't they?
Again, the meeting together doesn't necessarily mean synagogue. It just means
Mm-hmm.
meeting together. It doesn't really specify.
So, devil's advocate again, like how would you, if it wasn't church, how
Hmm.
would you do that?
So you're saying first principles thinking. We let go of what we know. We just look at Jesus and maybe Paul's teachings and how do we build our practice
Mm-hmm.
around that? Is that what you're asking?
Yeah, like or just like if you remove church from the equation, how do you like do what he's saying to do for the original intent?
Well, I
Like
think
encourage each other.
so. Like you and I both attended a church in Philadelphia called Circle of Hope, and they did something really interesting where they had what they called different cells, and so they would have, and it was like cells are part of a body. Cells make up a body. But it was like a double entendre because it was also like cells, like people meeting together. And so their idea of church was very much like you have your community, you have your small group, you guys hang out together, you guys live in the same community, and then on every Sunday night they would come together and like the cells would merge and become a body, and that's where you do like your communal worship. But most of the time, their model was most of the time it was this day to day meeting together, breaking bread together, hanging out together. And I mean, it's not perfect. I mean, no like system we create is, but I really liked what they had going on there. Um, and it was a little bit of a back to basics kind of mentality.
Sorry. So speaking of Circle of Hope, so they were I was listening to like the radio the other day, and they did like a someone did like a they wrote a book about Circle of Hope. They're
Hmm.
like a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist. Like it's a big thing. And they just spent like a year with Circle of Hope
Hmm.
and did like a big story on them. And I think like the outgrowth of that was they dissolved Circle of Hope because
What?
they felt like
Really?
they were no longer meeting their mission of like providing that kind of community. And their original intent was to like be kind of an opposing voice to like kind of conservative Christian evangelicalism, like
Okay.
trying to be more of what they felt like Jesus was originally calling people towards. So instead of just showing up at a church, actually doing those things. But they felt like in that process, as they grew, it became harder to do those things because like they just got more and more complicated systems that ended up working against what they felt like Jesus was calling them to do initially. So they dissolved the church.
Interesting.
So if you're really a follower of Jesus, you stop going to church and you start being the church.
Okay. Well, let's. I'll have to check that out. That's cool. So if we, what do you think, Tim? Like, if we were to strip it back, like first principle style, like get rid of everything we know and just kind of go off, like, Paul's and Jesus's teaching, what would church look like for you? Do you think?
Well, I think in the early church, it seemed like they met together all the time, and I think that makes sense. Like this is new, this is exciting, this is something that's like life changing, and like it seemed like one of the core functions of the church was like meeting each other's needs. So like whenever anybody had any need, somebody who had money or like assets would sell those assets and they would share it so that there's nobody who was poor in the church. And like you don't get that by doing like a Sunday service. You only get there by like knowing the intimate details of other people's lives and like, okay, that person seems fine on the outside, but I know there's this detail that like is affecting their life. And so I'm going to like take that on. So like I would say like it wasn't communist, like it wasn't imposed, but it was happening. Like it was organically growing out. So no one's forced to do it, but people always did it. So I feel like both like in the function and in the like product, like the fruit of that, it's just so different than what we have in like evangelical Christianity today, where it is systems based. It's like right and wrong. This is what you have to do. This is what you can't do. And like we don't ever really engage with, I feel like, the curiosity that maybe the first church had.
And there are elements of that. Like, I mean, you, especially with bigger churches, like you have food pantries, you have like, warming shelters, you have different like supports in place. But again, it's not like I'm helping you out because you're my friend and I meet with you all the time and you need help. It's a system that's created to help out
Yeah, it's usually
people.
insiders helping outsiders, which I don't think there's anything wrong with. I think that's great and like should be there. But it's very different than like we share everything because we are in this together. This is
Yeah.
the thing we're doing.
That's an interesting take. The insiders helping outsiders. That is how it is.
Yeah.
Or how, I mean, yeah, or like when Jesus sent out his disciples and he said not to take like an extra pair of
Mm-hmm.
clothes or shoes. It was like, I don't want you to come and preach to people from a place of superiority. I want you to come and speak with them from a place of need.
Mm-hmm.
Of like, I'm not better than you. I need to rely on you to help me out, and if you help me out, I'll, share the gospel with you. It's like a very different
Mm-hmm.
place from like church today, where we're helping you out. Like we're, if our church is growing, and if our church gets to the point where it has enough excess money, then out of that outpouring, we will help people, or we'll reach down
Mm-hmm.
instead of reaching up, and it's.
And it's not really based on the need. It's like if I have extra, we'll do this. Which like I don't think there's anything wrong. But it's like the thing in the early church was like because they were meeting together, like this thing was in their face. Like you see that person, that person, what's going on. And so when you see a need, like you meet it. And I don't think that that's possible, at least in like a larger church today, at least in the same way that they did it then, where you're intimately connected. And I think you can have like smaller cells, like Circle of Hope did, which I really appreciated that. So there's lots of people who were part of cells that weren't a part of the church, but not too many people who were in the church who weren't a part of cells. It's like that was their, like, people, the cells met together on Sunday. It wasn't like the church met together. Like, it seemed like their church was this group that met in people's houses, and it's usually people who lived in the neighborhood. Like, not as many people were traveling in from, the other side of town, which I think does change things.
Sure.
But I don't know.
All right. Well, let me ask you this then. So this is a little change of gears a little bit, but I'm curious your thoughts. So in Matthew chapter 6, it says, instruct people not to repeat words without thinking or babble on like pagans. And then we can dive into like the nuance here, which we probably should at some point, but because we don't know exactly like what he's referring to or how the pagans babble on or whatever. But it kind of implies that like speaking empty words in front of people at church is a negative thing.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I feel like rote prayer and things that we do oftentimes in church is that. So
Mm-hmm.
we'll do prayers like a transition. So like I lead worship, and oftentimes I'll do a prayer to transition
Mm-hmm.
from the worship to like the announcements.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not a prayer out of a place of like I really have something I need to pray for. It's a prayer like we need something to fill this spot in the service, so we do
Mm-hmm.
this. Or it's like we have a prayer. Some churches have like the prayer, like repetitive prayer that they do a lot. And I don't think this is a bad thing, but it does seem to be a little bit at odds with that verse in Matthew and different
Mm-hmm.
ways that they went about it. Do you have any thoughts on that?
So I have ADD, and I hate those things more than anything else because I zone out 100% of the time. We've been going to a church that does a lot of that recently, and it is the worst for my brain because it finishes and like I realize we just said a whole bunch of stuff, or at least everyone around me did, and I was looking at the ceiling or something. I think part of that for me, I'm not saying that's a good thing on my part, but it's not engaging, it's not real to my life, and so it's harder to engage. And I think sometimes those things can be really helpful in like jump starting that process of like engaging with ourselves and our life and like the people around us. But I think more often than not, it's the thing we do to do the thing, and there's not really any life there. And I think it's kind of this excuse we use to avoid really engaging with what's inside. Um, Not everybody, obviously, but that's my take, and it's extreme, I'm sure, but I really hate those.
And it's interesting. I mean, it's like definitely a part of church life, modern church life.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
I do think like so I'm also into like kind of self betterment and kind of like those self help circles a little bit. I hate that term, but and part of it is like
I
having
hate those people who do that.
okay,
So,
well.
but we're both hating, but it's different, I guess.
But there's a lot of power in like affirmations, like where I have things that like I'll say or
Mantra, yeah.
mantras or
Mm-hmm.
things to help you like get in a good headspace or there's I mean it's scientifically proven that like doing that kind of stuff like repetitively does like change your mindset.
Mm-hmm.
So having like and saying the Our Father or having like a prayer that you can recite to like center you. I think there is value there, but you're
Mm-hmm.
right that the way we do it is usually like I zone out too usually at those points. Like it's hard
Mm-hmm.
to like
I
really
think
get into it.
I'm sure it's helpful for someone, or they would never keep doing it, or at least I would hope not. But like, I think it is so easy to zone out because like we zone out when monotony occurs, and like when like you don't remember driving home, but you arrive in your driveway and you don't remember driving, like you were on autopilot.
Mm-hmm.
And at least from what I understand, our brains are so um on like optimizing all the time. So I'm not going to waste any energy on something that's not needed. And
Yeah.
conscious thinking takes a ton of energy. So like that background just autopilot kicks in whenever it can. Like that's kind of how we survive. And before like this century where we have lots of food, you needed to preserve all of your energy. I think like it's something built into our genetics that it's we zone out when we repeat things over and over. And I'm not saying it doesn't become a part of our insides, but it seems like Jesus was saying like, don't do that, don't babble on. Like he does give them like the Lord's Prayer there, which is what we kind of babble on now. Like we use that as like the repetitive thing, but it seems like maybe he's also talking about like you'll be heard because of all your words. I think like in that passage he says like you don't need to. God knows what you need before you ask. So like this is how you should pray. Um, I think there is like an interesting shift. It's like towards trusting God versus like earning the thing. It's like
Mm-hmm.
the pagans of the day, and I think a lot of Christians today, we think we'll get what we want or need because we ask for it. I think what he's saying there is asking isn't actually necessary. God already knows what you need. Like the flowers of the field don't ask him to create that kind of beauty that they have. Like God knows the numbers of your head. Like nothing has to. He preserves these things on his own. But like the act of trusting him, like asking him to give you like the food you need for the day, every day, and so like forgive us, and like we're committing to forgive. Like all these kind of elements are so good for us to remember, but we don't have to like say the right words in the right order to get his love or to get his provision. Like those are just he's gonna do.
I like that.
And we
That's
can
I feel like that takes the weight off of the shoulders, you know.
yeah. Which I think that like that is one of the main differences I think between a lot of the world religions and Christianity at its core was like you it's grace. Like you don't have to earn it. And I think that is like what a lot of churches and religion like puts back in is like you have to show up at church. You have to tithe this way. You have to dress this way, talk this way. And it's all getting back into earning. And it seems like that's kind of the opposite of what Jesus was all about.
Hmm. All
What
right,
do
so
you think, church man?
I think I like everything that you're saying there. So final thoughts, Tim. Um,
Mm-hmm.
well, anything bug you? Anything else bug you about modern church today that you feel like should go?
Well, I feel like I have just been like it's so lucky to have like been to and been a part of so many different types of churches like over the years, and like living or being involved in like groups of people from so many different places. And I do think like our churches are a direct reflection of who we are and not like the other way around. um I think like humanity is countercultural on like the top 10% and the bottom 10%. So you'll have like the top 10% who will question things in a good way, and the top or bottom 10% who will like oppose everything in like a negative way. But 80% of people just do whatever's happening and don't ever think about it.
Sure.
So I think like that's kind of where we are, and I don't think that that's helpful because I think there are so many things in church like Protestant, like there's like the Protestant Revolution or Reformation, but then like whole sects of Protestantism is just like political infighting between the Catholic Church and the King of England. There's so much nuance baked into our systems that are not
Sure.
helpful,
Yeah.
and like they're not biblical, and they're not even like close to the intent, it seems like, of what Jesus was shooting for. So I think it is like really good
I mean,
to
there's like 150 different or I forgot the exact number, but there's like a lot of
something like that.
denominations, and
Yeah.
it's all like, all right, we're gonna these people are like Wesleyans, and these people are
Mm,
evangelicals, and these people are
yeah.
like
So
Baptists, and it's
many.
all like just little variations of what they believe
Hmm.
the
And I
Bible's
think
saying.
it's like all around the rules of like this. They have it wrong. We have it right. This is how we do it. And it seems like at its core, Jesus and even Paul really didn't have many rules. It was like a couple basic ones that dictate almost everything in your life. But like you have to kind of measure everything up to that versus following these rules and then you're fine. You don't have to like engage with the real
And
stuff.
and something you pointed out in a previous podcast is that the culture in Paul's churches, the ones he was like planting and working with, were very different from each other. And like he spoke to them differently depending on where they were or what their
Mm-hmm.
culture was. So they
Mm-hmm.
had like their own unique identity, and he just kind of wanted to make sure they were getting the big stuff right, more or less.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting. I think to like that. I don't think there's anything wrong with fitting church to culture, but I think it doesn't mean it's right or wrong. It just means like this is the way that works for right now. I think we should be okay changing things as those things just like aren't useful.
Yeah, I agree. You got to evolve and
It's like
do what works.
if, if there's like a worship director, I think they probably should step down and let go of their job.
Okay,
That's just my own
that's a
personal
good
thing.
that's a good opinion.
Yeah,
We'll
it is
table that for now till the next
biblical.
podcast.
Some might
So,
say, it's 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 hard.
all right. Well, if anybody's still watching this, God bless you. Have a good week, and we'll see you all next time.